Welcome everyone to today's event, which is co-sponsored by us, the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization, MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and the MBTA Advisory Board. I'm just going to quickly go over some guidelines for participating in today's event. So as you'll have noticed, everyone will join the meeting with their microphones on mute. If you could rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and any affiliation, that would be wonderful. Please do not unmute yourself. If you would like to participate in the discussion, you can enter comments and questions in the chat box. And then during Q&A, you can also use the raise hand function to participate. You can find this by clicking either on the participants button at the bottom of the screen, and depending on your version of Zoom, it'll be in there or it'll be in the reactions button in the toolbar. If you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. And if you have any technical difficulties at any point, you can contact my colleague, Matt Archer, via the chat box.
Roisin, you just muted yourself.
Sorry about that. You can contact Matt via the chat box at marcher@ctps.org or at 857-702-3708. And with that, I will hand it back over to Sandy for intros.
Thanks, Roisin. 1 second, if you'll give me a moment, please. So I just wanted to welcome everybody on behalf of all three sponsors of this event, the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization and its Transit Working Group, which I manage, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and the MBTA Advisory Board. We are now going to, I'm going to go a little bit through each of the, or how the event is going to go today. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we're going to hear a little bit of a welcome from each sponsoring organization. We're going to have a presentation on their microtransit and their experience with it from each of our wonderful panelists. There's going to be a discussion amongst the panelists featuring the questions that you submitted when you registered. There will be some time for Q&A, hopefully at the end, and then we'll go a little bit over upcoming events. So if we can go to the next slide. I'm now going to turn it over to Tegan Tyke, who's the Executive Director of the Central Transportation Planning Staff, which is the staff to the Boston Region MPO, to welcome all of you.
Thanks, Sandy. And I'm very happy to have the opportunity to say hello at this event. I'm very excited about it. I am Tegan Tyke. I'm the Executive Director to the staff to the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization, or MPO, as you've heard a few times now. We are an agency that approves the use of federal funds, both on transportation projects, capital projects, as well as transportation planning work in the 97 cities and towns that make up the Boston region. And we do this in a way that serves the region's goals, which is we've established as the desire to promote a robust and equitable and resilient transportation system. In addition to looking at the use of federal funds, we also have as our mandate to engage stakeholders in the region and in the transportation sphere to have meaningful open dialogue about the issues that are so important to all of us. So this forum is an example of that. And one of the most rewarding outcomes for us in convening events like this is just to see the really broad range of transportation stakeholders, the representatives of agencies, members of the public, advocates, municipalities, everyone here together who are interested in this topic and ready to have a conversation. So I thank all of you for being here today to listen to the presentations, but then also to engage in this conversation together. So today's topic, microtransit, it is grounded in our efforts as an MPO to keep pace with emerging travel paradigms and those that can best serve our goals, our municipalities' goals and our partner agency goals in providing quality transit services to the public, in this case, focused on transit. And one of the things I want to acknowledge is that even with the planned upcoming transformation of the MBTA system, as well as the challenges that we are facing in the COVID pandemic in terms of uncertainty in many ways. We continue to hear from communities of all kinds and the public that there is still a very strong need for expanded and improved transit connections. So today we're going to be discussing microtransit as a way to adapt to those challenges and gaps, gaps might exist in more traditional fixed route service by offering more flexible, small scale and on-demand services. So hopefully microtransit isn't brand new to everybody. We know it's already here and that the importance of it might increase, but as an MPO, we are always very interested in thinking carefully and rigorously about how, where, and why it can advance the region's goals and how we can track its success in terms of working towards those goals. And so to that end, we look forward to having a conversation here co-hosted by our co-sponsors that Sandy already mentioned. And you'll hear from more from them in a moment. But first, I just want to say that we have this great panel here, and we're very happy to bring together people who have actual hands-on experience starting up microtransit, as well as some national experts who can zoom out and talk about this initiative from a more national scale. So I wanted to thank Angie, Nicole, Chris, and Patrick for being so much of a part of this conversation, and all of the rest of you again for coming to join us together. So with that, thank you, Sandy, for that opportunity, and I'll now pass it off to Travis Pollock with MAPC, who along with Sandy Johnston, who has been leading the planning for this event. So Travis.
Thanks, Tegan. So again, I'm Travis Pollock. I'm a senior transportation planner at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. And for those that don't know, we're the regional planning agency for the 101 cities and towns in Greater Boston. And a more expansive and more equitable regional transportation system is part of our new regional plan called Metro Common 2050. And MAPC is a member of the MPO. We work with Tegan, Sandy, and others at CTPS in assisting our region. MAPC first started planning for microtransit, or we first were exposed to it, or in a more detailed way in 2018, so just 4 years ago, when Sudbury, one of our communities, reached out to us and was interested in possibly doing a microtransit pilot. So we conducted at MAPC what we call an RFI, request for information, for the various microtransit operators to get a better understanding of how microtransit might best work in a more rural or developing suburban setting. And a lot has changed in that last 4 years. So we've gone from almost no pilots in Massachusetts to now several, which we'll hear from a couple of those here. But the questions remain on when, where, and how microtransit might best help with mobility and access in our region. And a better understanding of microtransit's role in the evolving transit needs of our region is needed, as Tegan mentioned. So I'm excited as well to hear from this panel today. I'll now turn it over to Mayor Patterson. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Travis. Good morning, everyone. My name is Amira Patterson, and I'm the transportation planner here at the MBTA Advisory Board. So Brian Kane, Deborah West, and myself make up the small office located in downtown Boston. However, we have a bigger role in representing the 176 cities and towns that receive MBTA service. Under the general law, the advisory board has a role in reviewing, commenting on the annual budget, and helping allocate federal funds to different MBTA capital projects. And also our very own Tom Koch is on the MBTA and MassDOT Board of Directors. So we're interested in microtransit, the municipalities, and we're so excited to have the conversation today. And we want to thank everyone who is a sponsor, all of the panelists, and thank you for having me, Sandy.
Thank you to Amira, as well as to Travis and to Tegan for the introductions. So as I mentioned before, my name is Sandy Johnston. I'm a transportation planner with the staff to the Boston Region MPO, where among other things, I manage the MPO's transit working group through which we're co-sponsoring this forum. Just going to recap briefly for those who may have arrived in the interim, how this is going to go, and then I'll introduce our panel. Each of our four speakers will give a brief talk about their experiences with and thoughts about microtransit. Then we'll have some discussion questions for them based in, among other things, the questions that you, the audience, submitted when you registered. And then, time allowing, we'll have some audience Q&A. We'll try to wrap things up by 2 p.m. Eastern. Feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time, and we'll be transcribing those and sorting through them to facilitate the Q&A. So with logistics out of the way, let's introduce our panelists in the order that you will hear from them. Angela or Angie Constantino works as the mobility manager at the Greater Attleboro Taunton Regional Transit Authority, or GATRA. Prior to GATRA, she was the mobility manager at the Regional Planning Agency on Massachusetts' South Coast, SERPED, for 10 years. Her focus at both places has been to increase the mobility in the region by educating stakeholders and riders about existing services, gauging need and facilitating partnerships, and marketing public services as the option of choice. Angie has a degree in public affairs from Wells College in Aurora, New York. Her interests and experience include marketing, outreach service, regional transit planning, and graphic design. Patrick Kennedy co-founded Space Between Design Studio in 2009 and currently leads urban planning, design, transportation, and development consulting practice. He's a planner and urban designer with 20 years of experience tackling complex urban challenges at local, national, and international scale. His focus is on the interrelationship between the multimodal mobility networks, urban design, and real estate market dynamics in order to deliver successful, sustainable, lovable, and sustainable places. He sits on the board of directors for Dallas Area Rapid Transit, is an adjunct professor in SMU's Master's Program in Sustainable Design and Development, and sits on the advisory boards of the University of Texas Arlington's Center for Transportation Equity, Decisions and Dollars, and the Dallas Independent School District's City Lab High School. Nicole Friedman works as Director of Transportation Planning for the City of Newton, where she is spearheading new transportation initiatives, including first and last mile shared mobility solutions, EV charging, and a car share and bike share. Before coming to Newton, Nicole served as Chief of Active Transportation for the City of Seattle and Director of Bicycle Programs for the City of Boston, during which time she helped transform Boston from the worst cycling city in the country to a recognized leader. Nicole has a degree in urban planning from Stanford University. She competed professionally in bike racing for 12 years, winning 2 national championships and competing for the United States in the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. And I will just add that anyone who has met her or worked with her knows that she absolutely still has that boundless athletic energy. So Chris Van Eyken is a transportation planner dedicated to the development of environmentally sustainable cities. Chris has provided technical assistance for bus rapid transit projects in the United States, Egypt, Kenya, and Uganda. In addition to his work on transit projects, he has contributed to non-motorized transport projects in the US and East Africa. Chris is currently a senior program associate at TransitCenter, a foundation that works to improve transit in order to make cities more just and environmentally sustainable. And with that, we'll jump right into it and hand it over to Angie.
Okay. Hi, everybody. As Sandy said, I'm Angie Constantino, mobility manager at GATRA. So we are, just a little background, we are a RTA in Southeastern Mass, and Jack wants to say hello to everybody. Hold on. Right, it's COVID, everybody. So we have Jack. So let me see if I can change this slide. Should be able to. It's not letting me. Can you go to the next slide? Thanks. So just talking a little bit about GATRA's service area. So we're a regional transit authority in Southeastern Massachusetts. We cover 29 communities, all the way from the Plymouth Situate area, all the way across to the Medways, Bellinghams, Franklin area, and almost down to the New Bedford area. So we have a combination of fixed routes, on-demand transit, complimentary paratransit, dial-a-ride, and we do local and long distance medical transportation. So it's a good mixed area. So we have the Attleboro and Taunton are our main cities, gateway cities. So it ranges from cities to some really rural areas. Next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons why we chose microtransit and why I think it might be, you know, everybody, it's the current buzzword, but I think it really might be a tool in our toolkit for moving forward. So it increases access to transit. It expands transit to underserved regions where fixed routes might not make sense, improves access to employment, Sometimes it can be hard to get a fixed route bus to work in a industrial park. So this would be a great option there. It also provides cost-effective, safer, and accessible transportation. Is a little bit safer and also provides the lifts on the vehicles a better option than Uber or Lyft. It's a great way to replace some underperforming fixed routes from back in the day when kind of that was our only toolbox, was dial-a-ride and fixed routes. And then it can provide those first and last mile solutions where extending fixed routes might not make the most sense. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about GATRA, we call it GATRA Go, GATRA On Demand. So that's kind of the umbrella that we use to talk about GATRA's microtransit services, but we actually have 4 separate microtransit services in GATRA's region. We use 2 different apps, Transloc and Spare Labs. We charge a flat $2 fee trip for everybody. Children 6 and under are free, but everybody else is $2 a trip. We use all accessible vehicles for the service, mostly in areas where, and I'll talk about our specifics, but in areas where we transition to a microtransit, there was dial-a-ride there before. So we transition those dial-a-ride vehicles, which were already had lifts and already accessible, into microtransit vehicles. And we describe our GATRA Go service as on-demand, same-day, safe and accessible public transit service, which is curb to curb, open to everybody for any purpose. And really in our area, it provides service where affordable transportation really is a lifeline and is hard to come by sometimes. Next slide. I'm going to talk about our first microtransit service, and I set it up so I'm going to talk a little bit about what the service area looked like prior to us putting microtransit in. So our microtransit geofence is that dark blue line that goes across. It encompasses the towns of Foxboro, Mansfield, and Norton. So prior to microtransit, this area had a fixed route which connected Wheaton College, so Norton up through Mansfield Crossing and up to the Mansfield train station. And this route kind of acted as commuter service for residents in Norton and Mansfield, and also student transportation. And then there was also a commuter shuttle from like a town lot in Foxboro that brought people to the Mansfield MBTA station, and dial-a-ride service in Foxboro, Mansfield, and Norton for seniors and persons with disabilities. Next slide. So the service started as a pilot in August of 2019. It was Foxboro and Mansfield predominantly. We recently added Norton. So what happened was we suspended that fixed route I just talked about during COVID. And when we were in talks to bring it back, when the college came back and when it became an issue and we talked about their transportation needs, we opted to kind of replace that fixed route with microtransit. So we dropped our geofence down to cover that area. We run our service 6:30 to 8, Monday through Friday, and then Saturday and Sunday 12 to 8. And for all of our services in both apps, you can book using the app up to 14 days in advance, but you can also call dispatch. So there's a phone number available for those who do not have a smartphone in all 4 service areas. So we originally started with 2 vehicles, and then we added 1 in November when we added Norton. Some of our challenges. One of our biggest challenges in Foxboro has been that when we started the two original pilots, they overlap in Foxboro. So GATRA Go Connect covers Foxboro East, and GATRA Go United covers Foxboro West, and having both 2 different apps and both services available in Foxboro has caused much confusion. So we're hoping that once we go back out for software and back out for services, that we'll be able to combine it into one larger area with one app, which would be ideal. Also getting college students to walk to specific stops within a college campus is proving daunting. And and the college wants to pay for the students to ride, but maybe not like all the time, and maybe a cap. So like working out what, that financial side of it has been a little bit difficult. Next slide. And then that's our ridership. Sorry, can you go back one? I'm sorry. Our ridership is at the bottom there. In 2020, we did 8,800 rides, and in 2021, we did 14,631, and that does not include December ridership. That was pulled prior. That's where we are now. Thank you. Our second service is we call GATA Go Coastline, and it's in Plymouth. So in South Plymouth, specifically South Plymouth, Plymouth is gigantic. I'm not sure, like for reference, Plymouth is just huge. It should be illegal. I don't know. It's gigantic. So I don't know if that's what you're supposed to tell, when, where the rock is, you can't have this much service area, but, they get testy, but it's fine. So it's a very, very large service area. Just this geofence that you're looking at now is just South Plymouth. It extends way farther up and way farther west. So we had kind of spotty dial ride service available in South Plymouth, and it was only, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and it was very spotty. So we used a grant and expanded it for GATA Go Coastline to cover this whole geographic area, and then take people basically from South Plymouth to that kind of gray and white dot at the top, and that's where all the fixed route buses meet. So people who need to go farther north can transfer to a fixed route bus. And that was kind of our idea here. And then I did put on here that we have a deviated fixed route, which we do. It runs from Clements Market to Bruno's Corner right now, and it extends 3/4 of a mile in either direction. So, but we're hoping to take the deviation off that route. It's currently in the plans in order to, have the microtransit pick up those 3/4 of a mile, but keep the fixed route running for people who need to just make that trek without having the bus having to deviate, so that we can go farther south, just cover Sagamore. Anyway, getting into the weeds here, but that's our plan for that. So that will be incorporated soon. Next slide. So we started this in October 2020. We're only running it Monday through Friday, predominantly seniors trying to get to the senior center, medical appointments, that kind of thing. We're running with 2 vehicles. Same thing, app and call dispatch, and challenges is large service area, which I already went over. So that's that service. Our next one, next slide. GATA Go United. So this one was started in the throes of COVID. We had quite a bit of service in these 4 towns. So this regional area, and Sandy, make like arm motions when I get to be a time thing, like wave at me. And so we had 4 communities encompass this area: Franklin, Rentham, Foxboro, and Norfolk. We had a fixed route that connected all these communities because that was a need prior to microtransit kind of being a tool. We needed a fixed route in this area just because we needed service in this area to connect them, but a fixed route really didn't make sense. And as the person who planned that fixed route and did the best she possibly could, I knew when we planned it that it wasn't going to be the best idea, but you do what you do when you have to do it. But as soon as microtransit came around, this was the first option. I was like, we have to do microtransit in this area because these fixed routes aren't working. So we had one fixed route that served kind of like this loop, and then we had one fixed route in Franklin that kind of ran just within the town, and then we had a regional dial-a-ride which covered all 4 towns for seniors and persons with disabilities. And then this area also has a long distance medical service component where you can go like 5 miles outside the service area for medical appointments, and then with specific days that we go to Boston and Worcester and that kind of thing for seniors and persons with disabilities. Next slide. So this started in December of 2020. So this was, we had suspended all services in this region. So we brought services back, all of these services back as microtransit. You can book both ways on this. And then something we're doing a little bit different with this is that we included the local and long distance medical in the app. So like we only have access to it on the back end, but because we did it that way, we have the ability to run the service with a shared fleet. So we book the long distance medical trips, but if say, you know, there aren't as many local, we call it local long distance, but like within a few miles, if there aren't as many trips, the vehicles are then free to be used in the larger service area for regular GATA Go trips. So we're basically using it as a dispatching app for our long distance medical because it can't be seen from the app side of things, but it allows us to use it as a shared fleet, which really works for us. We're doing it with about 3 to 4 vehicles, usually 3, or usually, actually we added another one. So I think it's 4 to 5 vehicles now, sorry, 4 to 5 vehicles. And the 5th vehicle is really like when we know the college, Dean College in Franklin is gonna be really busy, we add another vehicle on. So again, Foxboro is an issue. And then this was also an issue because Franklin wanted to pay for rides to the Council on Aging, wanted to pay for rides in the town. So trying to kind of figure out how to pull those kind of things out on the back end was a struggle, and work with people and billing, but it's great. And then college students using it was also, but we did, so I put the year ridership there. So from December 15th, 2020 to 2021, we did 21,000 rides. And last but not least, the 4th service, next slide, is GATA Go Explorer, which is the newest. We had a commuter shuttle that ran from multiple locations in Pembroke, small town on the South Shore, to a neighboring town's commuter rail station. And when COVID hit, we brought it back as it was before, and there was no ridership. So all those people, I guess, working from home. So it wasn't we expanded it. So we expanded the hours, and we're trying to work with local stakeholders to see if we can see if they can use it for employment transportation and stuff. So we're running it with just 1 vehicle. We're still working on kind of promoting it, and this is a little bit of a fluid one, but our biggest issue with this is that it's the town of Pembroke residents, but all the places that those residents need to go are outside the service area, which was hard. So you have to put like just the points of where they can go with the main service area for like origins. That was a little bit difficult because they all want to go to Hanover. And that's a struggle, but we're working on it. And that's my microtransit update. Anybody has any questions, we can talk later. Yeah.
Thank you, Angie. Very thorough. You guys have a lot going on. It sounds like it's definitely been some interesting ups and downs.
Yeah.
I would like to bring up Patrick Kennedy to be our next speaker.
Thank you, Sandy. Since you already introduced who I am, I will just say greetings to everybody from Dallas, Texas, where it is 70 degrees and sunny outside right now, which is part of the reason why this former Yankee chose one of the most sprawling places he could find to live and work. So thank you all for having me. I'll be talking about the way that Dallas Area Rapid Transit, where I sit on the board of directors, has been rolling out our on-demand service within the context of a complete bus network redesign, which we've been working on for 2 years and are launching next week. So it's a pretty intense time for us, and we're very hopeful that it's going to go well, of course. So to introduce all of you, since I'm assuming this is primarily a New England audience, Dallas, Texas is a difficult place to provide transit. It is sparse, low density. It is highly segregated socioeconomically, as well as in land use patterns. The graphic to the right is minimum required population density for transit to be functional, and that's in the orange and brown areas. So it's highly dislocated, disconnected, and low density. But that's the nature of the beast, and we're trying to improve things. To give you a little bit more context, Dallas-Fort Worth is about 8 million people right now. I think we're about to pass Chicago as the 3rd largest metropolitan area in terms of population, similar population to London, which in the white outline generally fits inside of Dallas County. So I think we've got 4 times the developed land area of London, if not more. But just give you a sense of what we're dealing with and how sprawled out the area is. More so, it's not just that it's sprawled out, it's divided, that we've got a significant north-south divide where the primary low-income population is concentrated in the southern sector of the city of Dallas. It's also some of our highest bus ridership area. Meanwhile, our job growth is continuing north towards the Oklahoma border, even outside of our service area. So it presents a significant challenge of how do we connect those households that are spending the most on transportation because of a car-dependent development. How do we link those people to jobs and opportunity and connecting the labor market to the job market? So that's generally some of the challenges that we're dealing with. On top of that, we spend some of the least amounts in the country per capita on public transit, and that's primarily because the state contributes virtually nothing, definitely nothing to Dallas, San Antonio, or Houston. I think Austin gets a little bit to serve the capital. So we get nothing from the state. We're largely funded through sales tax of the member cities that have voted to tax themselves a penny of all sales tax. All $100, a penny of all dollar sales tax goes to transit. And so I was largely inspired by what Houston had done in 2014. I'm sure many of the transit planners are familiar. They had hired Jarrett Walker and to redesign their bus network in 2014. This is the red is their high frequency, all day high frequent network. And they went from that to that with no increased budget, connecting 1 million people, 1 million more people to 1 million more jobs, by focusing less on downtown, becoming more of a gridded network, and of course not changing the budget, which they ended up coming back and re-adding some service to some legacy routes that had been removed, and they've added some of those things back. But that provided a lot of lessons learned for us as we started going through a similar process. And Christoph Spieler, who published a book on transit afterwards, was serving on the board at Houston at the time, and he put together this graphic comparing the high frequency network of Houston compared to Dallas at a similar scale, overlaid on population and job centers, which is sort of the yellow and purple. And Houston and Dallas metros are virtually identical on a national and international scale, statistically similar socioeconomics, demographics, population density, transportation patterns, et cetera, et cetera. But you can see that their redesign helped them have a much more frequent all-day network serving their population, whereas our high-frequency network was not even just our rail system, but only the rail system where multiple lines were running on our tracks. So we had to have 2 lines running on one rail to deliver all-day high frequency. And so that was a problem. And I began advocating for more frequency through the system, and eventually was put on the board of directors by Dallas City Council to continue advocating for better service and more frequency, because obviously the rail system that we have only covers about 5% of our service area. So bus has to do a much better job. And what I found, of course, was a bus network that I thought was pretty incomprehensible. When you look at the map, the color codes didn't mean a whole lot to the average rider, and neither did the route categories. It didn't convey frequency or the level of service. And so we wanted to sort of fix that. But of course, there was also not any all-day high-frequency bus routes at the time. And so once I was put on the board of directors, I was able to start digging into the data. The numbers here you can't see them, but that's part of the point, that it's too much data. But I went through every single route to analyze them. And the key takeaway was what I found, that in that southern sector, the southern half of the city of Dallas, where our bus ridership is very high, I found that 70% of routes serving the southern sector had highest service in peak hours, but the most demand in midday. And so these were routes where people had 60-minute midday frequencies, and it was just not adequate service for the all-purpose riders that were trying to get to wherever they were trying to go. And so we had to completely rethink the system. It wasn't about just changing one route here, one route there. And so after about 2 years of lobbying the rest of the board, they agreed to go forward with a complete bus network redesign rather than sort of an incremental approach. Even though we did that, we still ended up having a bit of an incremental approach by accident, because That same year, we were adding a number of buses to our fleet, including a number of electric buses. But that gave us the chance to work with staff and say, hey, why don't we test some of our theories of what we're going to do with our full network redesign on this additional service that we're going to add. So let's untangle some routes, let's improve stop and route spacing, and let's concentrate our frequency in sort of key areas by taking away some service in some areas. And that's where we started to expand our on-demand, or what we call our GoLink service. So that's when we transformed it from a sort of a pilot here and there to a broader type of service. For somebody who lectures 3-hour-long classes, I get hoarse very quickly. So excuse me for that. But our GoLink service, just to give you the general idea, I'm sure you're very aware, is that we set up various zones, and you hail through our proprietary app that we have at DART called GoPass app. And it'll pick you up on the door, but it is a pulled service, so it'll pick up others along the way, and it only drops off at specific areas. And of course, we very well know some of the pros and cons going into this, as was covered in the last presentation, of some convenience and comfort improvements. It's got full ADA capabilities, which is very useful for sort of the last 1 to 3 miles of service, particularly in a city, in a region where our sidewalk networks are quite poor, very disconnected, and frankly, you basically need a mountain bike to use our sidewalks where there are sidewalks. On the other hand, we've had some challenges in areas where it's primarily an elderly population or low-income population having enough use of the app. So we also, of course, have, there's a dispatch line you can call, but people tend not to use that and are more comfortable with the traditional fixed route. So we've had some challenges getting people more aware to it. The big issue, though, that we knew well going into it was that it doesn't typically scale with demand, that there's high marginal costs. As ridership or demand increases, either costs or travel time tend to go up with that demand. And so we just wanted to be very careful of how we've rolled it out, and as we continue to evaluate the service within budgetary constraints. And so, as you all know, there's zones that get set up, and as I mentioned, it'll pick you up anywhere you request, and it'll drop you off at certain key locations. This happens to be the South Dallas GoLink zone, which includes Fair Park, which is the state fairgrounds, as well as the Cotton Bowl. But it'll also drop people off at rail stations. And January 24th, when we completely redesign the bus routes, it'll also drop you off along the core frequent bus routes that go through the area. And so as we were moving through this process to completely redesign our bus network, each of the board members went through this exercise where we had to allocate service through either frequency or coverage. I find this interesting in that board members that were a team that was entirely urban and a team that was entirely suburban, or these two middle ones that were entirely about frequent service. So that's when I knew that we had some common ground and we'd be able to find some solution and path forward for how we were going to budget our operational dollars towards either frequency or coverage. And we ended up going from 55% on frequency / ridership to 75%. And that's indoctrinated into policy, and it's going to take a 2/3 vote to amend that in the future, which is going to be key here in a second. We also had to discuss some of our values, that what were we spending dollars on between capital and operations. And as you all know, because the federal government largely will give you about 50%, because we're not highways. For capital projects, you have to take on debt, and a lot of that long-term debt building out our rail network was undermining service quality. So hundreds of millions a year in debt service instead of operations meant that the bus system had been pretty starved. So hopefully that's something that we're starting to move away from. We also surveyed our riders in a non-binary way. Were they interested in having stops closer to their destination? Would they be interested to walk further for more frequent service? Or they just wanted to focus on the brass tacks and just get me there faster, which I think was useful to give our staff some flexibility in planning on how to sort of really focus on that last bullet point, which is what the general public generally cares about for the most. And so as we moved from the existing network to our new network that we're rolling out next week, which is the maps on the left and the right, where we were able to go from 6 core frequent routes that we had after the 2019 changes to 22 that we're going to have next week. And we did that by consolidating routes and cutting down fixed route service in very low ridership areas. into GoLink zones. And so this was our way to increase frequency, and that's been my priority, is how do we get more frequency in the system, particularly where it's needed. But we've also set up a sort of an alpha fund and a beta fund, and I'll talk about that in a second, even though we're within this budget neutral approach. So as we started rolling out the network and unveiling it to the public and discussing it with them and allowing them to react to it, as well as applying some data, we could see where some gaps were. Either they would tell us where it was, or we'd have some of these orange/brown areas where service was being reduced and there was less access through the entire system. And that's why we had a fund of a couple million for what I would call alpha patches during the planning process, to say, okay, you know what, you're right, we missed this. Let's evaluate and let's see how many dollars that we want to put to it. And then the beta will be after launch. So we're going to have about a 6 to 12 month period. We'll have a few $1 million to either add service, adjust service, whether that's fixed route or GoLink. It's just going to be sort of all a reaction to how we see the system operating and how we want to appropriate those resources to improving service. But having done that, we ended up expanding several GoLink zones, increasing them to ensure that we weren't leaving some people behind, some areas behind, and expanding coverage. And that really allowed us, one, to generate these isochrones, but those are really improvements. So the dark blue overlay is what we could do now, and the lighter blue is what we'll be able to do after the launch. And so you drop in a certain area, which is high ridership currently, but generally low income, and now there's 170, 200,000 plus more jobs that are within a 60-minute commute. So we were able to do that largely through increased frequency, but also through some of those GoLink zones at the periphery. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the expansion of the one to the bottom there, which is the inland port area, which is for the most part outside of our service area. And so we worked with the city, the county, and obviously the transit agency, as well as the businesses in that area, which is a port that's largely based on highways. So it's, you've got Amazon fulfillment center and things like that. And we partnered with the private sector to create an LGC, or local government corporation, where city, county, DART, and the private sector all have funding responsibilities and all sit on the board. But it allowed us to connect a number of our system and a number of people to all the jobs in that area that we, as a board, we're also not comfortable providing fixed route service to areas that aren't paying a penny sales tax like the rest of the system. But it does allow us to provide service to that area. And we've been steadily expanding that, as I mentioned. But as we first rolled it out, even during the pandemic, we've been increasing ridership in that particular area. The number of unique riders has been increasing as well. You'll see these dips in February from 2021. That's where we had the freeze, and not just a freeze, but below 0 degrees in Dallas for the second time in recorded history. And the entire city was essentially shut down for a week. And the customer satisfaction has been very high. So just like through a TNC company, you can provide your star rating immediately after your service, and it's been quite high, which is something that, of course, that we've baked into our system to keep an eye on, so we know how well we're doing. But of course, as I mentioned, there's this sort of positive negative feedback loop where as demand rises, we either add service and costs, or travel time and response time starts to increase. And so our goal is 15 minutes or better in all of our zones, but it is steadily increasing, but it is below the 15-minute threshold where we start to really pay attention more closely. So what we're doing next week, or actually December of this past year in 2021, we rolled out the 30 GoLink zones that we added, and we're starting to get some data back on that. But we wanted to roll these out in advance, just so we could get some market penetration and awareness of the GoLink zones, which I guess we could discuss whether it was smart to do that right before changing all the routes that we'll be delivering people to. But we also wanted to it was very cheap to roll it out early, so we wanted to do that ahead of time. But it also covers, our new zones are going to cover about a 30% of our service area. And so it's about 3% of our total operating budget. So 3% covers 30% of our land area. We also supplement our service with Uber Pool. So we provide about 80% and they provide about 20% of those rides. The yellow are the ones that we rolled out a couple of years ago, and the blue are our additional ones. And like I mentioned, this now covers 30% of our land area, all in low ridership areas that we were going to cut service from entirely. So it allows us to maintain a certain amount of coverage. So working with staff, we knew we had to update our service standards while rolling this out because we want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on it, and we have sort of the objective metrics to do so in a smart and thoughtful way, which is important. What kind of land area, what kind of span, all those good things. And that's what I jokingly call, we set up a chutes and ladders, which is an objective metric to serve as whether we want to cut or increase service in a certain area outside of the generally planned process, where we want to say, hey, we want to add a new route or something like that. So what happens is, over time, certain routes tend not to perform up to standards. And what that meant was there was this constant leak of operational budget into our general fund, which, knowing us, we would say, hey, let's put that to our next big capital project rather than keeping it in the bus system. So as part of this rewriting of our service standards, what I worked with staff to do is that we would have, if there were cuts where we saved money, those savings had to remain, one, in the bus system in our operations, and two, we had to maintain that 75-25 frequency versus coverage ratio. And that's important because if we're cutting fixed route service and turning it into on-demand service, that means that's in that 25%, and we'd be increasing that from 25. So we would have to take those savings and have to reinvest them into the 75, which means we're adding frequency elsewhere, which I felt was important to prevent that sort of slow bleed of the bus operation system. And that's where we're at now. We don't quite yet know exactly what the sweet spot is going to be for subsidy per rider or rides per hour or customer satisfaction. Obviously, we want all of those things to be great. What we have learned is that that on-demand service has been increasing, even though just like our rest of our fixed route service, whether rail or bus, we're still at about 2/3 of pre-COVID ridership. But then the question is, how do we ensure that we don't let this kind of service, because it does tend to be popular, how do we not let it cannibalize from the rest of our operations system? And I'm wondering, and I don't know the answer to this, but maybe that is that at a board level, we sort of cap the percentage of our operations budget that goes to it. But this is just me thinking out loud because it's not something that we've broached quite yet. So that's where we stand, and I'm happy to answer questions when we get to Q&A. Thank you all.
Thank you, Patrick. So interesting. And I think you're tackling a lot of the same questions that we're going to be looking at here in the Boston region with the MBTA going through its own network redesign process. So before we go on to Nicole, I'm observing that we're probably not going to have a ton of time for Q&A at the end. We do have some questions in the chat, and I would encourage our presenters, if you would like to engage with those questions in the chat, since it's less likely that we'll have significant time at the end to go through the Q&A. But that being said, let's turn things over to Nicole Friedman from the city of Newton to talk a little bit about their NUMO microtransit.
Hello, everyone. It's always fun to be the last speaker. I hope many of you are still awake. We will see. Sandy and the MPO, first off, thank you for hosting the webinar and for allowing me to speak. For those of you that don't know, the MPO, through their Community Connections grant, has really helped fund our NUMO system. So we're thrilled to report back. And probably the most important thing I want to share is that as of now, we think our NUMO system is very successful, and we are so excited about how it's working out. And this is after many, many sleepless nights. Can we go to the next slide? Because I can't seem to shift it.
Nicole, if you just try clicking onto the screen first, you should be able to. And now try using the arrow keys.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. That worked this time. It didn't before. So what is NUMO? NUMO was our hope in Newton to create a technology-enabled transportation system serving all residents, students, and employees in Newton. That's quite straightforward. As you can see from the middle, we wanted a turnkey system. So we wanted someone to come in and do not just provide us software, but provide all the operations, and we could just oversee the program. And our goals, like many of you all, one was very much a sustainability and a congestion goal. So reducing single occupancy vehicle trips, reducing trips in internal combustion engines, increasing access to jobs, and equity in terms of serving low-income senior and youth populations at a reasonable cost. One of the things that should have been here, that's just so obvious, is, and it's so straightforward, helping people who don't have a way to get around the city, get around the city. That should first and foremost always be the goal of a transportation system. And I should be writing that in all future grant applications. So by way of background, for 10 years prior to 2019, we had a transportation system for Newton for seniors run through our senior center. And it was basically a taxi contract. It did 25,000 trips a year to seniors. So very successful. We paid the taxi company $13 a trip. Seniors had to reserve 72 hours in advance. And this worked. But one of the challenges was taxi companies started going out of business. They could no longer do, they couldn't be serving these trips. So we had seniors calling regularly about missing medical appointments, not getting picked up. There just weren't drivers left. And we also felt like the goal from the senior center is improve the quality of life for seniors so they can live car free and car light. And a 72-hour reservation period didn't seem to do that. So 2019 to 2021, we launched Numo for seniors. And this was replacing our taxi system. It was a microtransit system by VIA. And even when we launched this, we were looking forward to the citywide system that we have now. This was just the first step of it. We had 4 vehicles, one being a Wave. It was open Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, weekends 9 to 12. Sliding scale fare, 50 cents for low-income members. You could go to select locations in Newton, but basically everywhere in Newton, and then select medical appointments across the border. Book by phone or app. If you had a recurring medical appointment, you could pre-schedule that. And some of the things we learned and the takeaways is, number one, this was a very important service. It served 400 trips a week. It's on track for 25,000 a year before COVID. Shared trip rate was about 30%. And the ETA was good, on-time booking. Rates from seniors dropped substantially down to 30 to 60% of what pre-COVID is. We're fine with that. But some of the takeaways we have, the satisfaction rate by the seniors for this service was lower than we would have liked. And when we surveyed people about, what they liked and didn't like, they didn't like the hours and they didn't like the wait times. So what was interesting is at the time we were looking whether we do microtransit or a service like Lyft. And what we know about something like Lyft or Uber, it has some advantages and some disadvantages. Lyft would be cheaper. It would provide 24/7 service. It wouldn't provide the shared trips, but it has a scale that we didn't have. So at 400 trips per week, I feel like we were right at the bare minimum of where microtransit works. So we had 3 to 4 vehicles moving at any one time, and this was great. The challenge was if a driver didn't show up, the entire system would just clog up and it would be a real failure that day. We would get calls and calls and calls from seniors. The other thing that was a challenge is if a senior's medical appointment that started at 4:30 runs late, it's 5:01. They're trying to get home and they can't. So, then you sort of look at the scale where you're at with, very rigid hours. When we're paying a flat fee, it becomes complicated. But the biggest issue was if we had a surge or a driver no-show, which happens at a 4-vehicle system, you have no buffer built in. So I always feel like 25,000 trips a year was kind of the minimum for that. The other thing that's interesting is the sharing rate was okay, but it's not a great sharing rate. And I think, number one, you need to think of sharing as related to how many trips you have and the density of your city. So at 25,000 trips, the rate is sort of, it means that 30% of the trips will have a time when you have 2 passengers or more in it. Your sharing rate is going to be what it is. If we're a much denser city or we have many more riders, that sharing rate will go up substantially. But still, it's sharing. And when you look at how these people would have made the trips otherwise, we were getting people out of single vehicles into shared trips many of the times. The third thing I want to just point out is there's multiple ways to pay. We were paying a flat fee to provide 25,000 trips. This did not have an active God clause. So in COVID, we were paying the same amount for half the trips. Had we gone with Lyft, we would have paid by trip and it would have been cheaper. So you may want to think about what method you use to pay. Do you pay per service hour? Do you pay a flat fee? Or do you pay per trip? And get that active God in there, that clause. The last thing with the senior service to think about is many of our seniors actually did not like on demand. They were nervous. Half their trips are medical appointments. You have to be there for a medical appointment. And if they get a high demand message because there's a surge and they miss their medical appointment, that's quite bad. Similarly, if you have a 95-year-old traveling alone and you give them a high demand message when they're trying to leave the grocery store, it's not like they can stand there. So that's kind of an emergency situation. You don't want times when they can't get a vehicle. So what that means sometimes is, do you want to have the ability to pre-schedule trips? Our seniors did and do want that. And we've recently allowed them to pre-schedule for all medical trips. Well, 50% of our seniors have cell phones, smartphones. Only 20% were using them to book trips. The service is much better. And people are much happier when they use a smartphone. So you need to think through that. And the other thing is the customer service when you have seniors has to be much greater. The average call time was 10 minutes and 80% of them were calling by phone. Okay, so let's go forward. So it was very interesting. Then we wanted to expand and we had the workforce transportation grant from MassDOT and that was for employees. So we said, let's build off of Numo and have a commuter service that's functioning primarily to get people to and from our Wells Ave Business Park, which has 4,000 employees, and help them get to the T, which is almost 2 miles away. Everyone was driving to the Wells Ave area, and the T is right there, and it was the green line. And as we looked at it, we said, well, we probably need more than just the green line. Only 25% of these 4,000 employees even live off of the green line. Let's expand it so you can also get to the commuter rail. And some of my sleepless nights were, I don't think 4,000 people is enough to support a transportation system. That's just not enough bodies. So we opened it up to 10 designated transit and job stops. 7:30 a.m. to 6 p.m., $2 corner to corner. And what was really interesting, even though we added these 10 stops, we had very low ridership. It was sort of terrifying. We've just created something and we're not getting people using it. And part of me was like, I think it's the fact that we have these 10 stops, but this was a terrifying 2 months and this was always sort of an interim step. So we pushed forward and in October, a few months later, we expanded this to everyone in Newton can travel everywhere in Newton. And our ridership just skyrocketed and we couldn't be happier. We're now at averaging about 175 or more trips every single weekday. And we're using 7 vehicles. So we've gotten a lot more of efficiency from more vehicles. So when you look back at our senior service versus now, what you see is people are much happier. We have 7 vehicles, so you've got that buffer for surge periods. We also have seniors who have their most ridership in the middle of the day, commuters on the edge. So we actually have a system that's not very peaky, which is the dream in transportation. We have a much higher sharing rate. Utilization is another way to look at sharing. It was 1.5 with the seniors, 2.2 here, and that's a fantastic thing. And we can fit many more people in. Each vehicle can serve many more people in a given hour and is. Total trips to date, 8,500 in just a couple months, 2 months. Our biggest week was about 900 trips. Max was 195. And what you can see is the trend is going up. But I think this graph says it all. Orange was the seniors, and we've had that service for years. We didn't expect much, but with the extra marketing and dropping their rate down to $2, we saw a tiny bump in senior trips. But about seniors, it's really, they don't have a way to get around the city. Those that needed it knew about the system and they're using it. So that's pretty flat. And you can see in the middle, this was our Numo for commuters. and our marketing for Numo for commuters was not much different from Numo for everywhere. And you can see just a few people were using it. And it was just, I think those 10, limiting to those 10 locations just didn't work, and trying to focus on something that was such a small population, there was just not enough people that were gonna use it. The other thing about Wells Ave is everyone currently drives there. So not many people are gonna wanna take a shuttle to the T when they could just drive and park for free. But then you see, we captured all these people that help all these other trips to and from many different places. And it's been incredibly successful. Great wait times, lots of new riders, short trip times, even with the sharing. So I'm gonna go to the next slide. In terms of demographics, what's so interesting is we are serving the people that really don't have other ways around the city. We are working a lot with low-income residents, 35% on public assistance, low household incomes, a lot of school trips. Newton South is the most popular. Newton South High School is our most popular destination. Newton North is top 5. Lots of trips to and from school, to and from transit. And, anecdotally sometimes says it all. We've heard a number from the disability community. This allows us to get around in real time, and it's a game changer. I've got a lot of calls from single moms, actually. And for them, it was like, how do I get my kid to an after school activity? Either I work or I get my kid to an after school. And I was shocked by how many single mom calls I got. We had a number of refugee sponsors sign up for the people they were working with to use the system, and obviously commuters. So just, I can't emphasize it enough. Like, you can do cost per trip, you can think about all these other goals, but at the end of the day, we are helping people that don't have another way around the city get around. So how do we measure success? I don't know what happened to my slides here. Based on the goals is how I do it. So 1, we got turnkey operations. That's great. We don't have to operate the system, and it does work well. 2, through our survey, and we'll do another one in 6 months. We did a survey after the commuter rollout, and then we'll do it again after everything. It's clear we're working with low-income seniors and youth populations quite a bit. We're charging $2. Clearly, job access. I've also gotten a lot of calls from people that live in Waltham or Watertown and are trying to access service jobs in Newton. So I feel great about that. And we need to analyze the sustainability impacts. They are there. I believe they're positive in a good way, but we can get that much more measurable. So let's talk money. And I actually blacked out all of the actual dollars, but the operations fee is $980,000 per year. The senior system is about $500, and that's a flat fee. And then on the commuter system, technically it's 2 contracts, it'll eventually be 1. The commuter system is $58.11 per vehicle per service hour. And you can do the math. Either way, it's about the same. So 7 vehicles, 11.5 hours a day. I think that comes out to 8,260 hours or more. Anyway, funding sources, there's for the seniors, community transit grant program. That's for operations, that's for seniors. We are so grateful for them. That was what got the senior system up and running. Workforce transportation grant from MassDOT, that was a one-time grant. That got us to the first expansion towards commuters. Community connections was a dream come true. We would never have been able to do this without them. It's just awesome. And, it was such a hard run from the senior system to the first commuter, and for it to turn out from so many sleepless nights and so many challenges to being an overwhelming success has been unbelievable. Our city, through the Department of Senior Services, puts in cash. UMass has come on and they're supporting it with $60,000, and that will be an ongoing and very important relationship. And then working a lot with new developers and putting things in their special permit, but trying to get them to contribute to sustainability as part of their mitigation. Long-term financial sustainability, we all need to talk about this together. Public transportation is expensive. It will never be financially self-sufficient. It's almost it's anathema to the definition of public transportation. What we do know in terms of long-term sustainability financially is the cost per trip will go down as we get more trips, and our rate of trips is still growing. And as we add more vehicles, the cost per vehicle service hour will go down through our operator. It might go down as much as 20%. And I think the trips will go up 20 to 50%. So you get some reduction that way, even if the overall cost goes up. And what we really need to do is work very much on the development and partner funding and push that up because we know that operating grant funding goes down. In Newton, we're in a very tough position, though. We do not have a regular source of operating funding. We are not an RTA. There is no RTA other than the MBTA. And it's a real challenge because as much as I want to hope that we can pull this off long-term, it's a real challenge, and it's a big burden to expect developers when we're asking them already to put in affordable housing and contribute to utilities to also pay a significant amount for this. So we're working on it. I hope we come back next time and let you know that after many more sleepless nights, we figured this piece out perfectly. And I hope we will do that. So lessons learned. Number one, seniors have unique needs. We started with vans. They didn't want to get into them. They couldn't step up. We switched to sedans. We made the sedans hybrid, which was fantastic. We now have our own customer service, dedicated customer service agents, because they require so much assistance instead of going to VIA's big call center. That was a great improvement. They also need more information because they're not using the smartphones. Number two, we talked about it. Scale is imperative for microtransit. Microtransit is not one vehicle circling for 500 trips a year. That's called a person that's doing pickups. Microtransit requires trip sharing, and you need a certain amount to circulate so you can get to people reliably in a short amount of time. What we learned from our commuter system is that fixed routes and stops definitely has limits. The second we opened up to the whole city, ridership skyrocketed. We learned that trip sharing is definitely relative to density. So as we increase the number of trips, we will increase the percent of trip sharing. We can't really do anything about our land use, so that's kind of fixed. But if we move this to Watertown, which is twice as dense, our trip sharing would be even higher. And public transportation is expensive, as is microtransit. But we feel like we are supporting people that really need this service. And we're doing a great thing. So we're very pleased with that. Next steps, we are working hard to electrify the fleet, switch all our sedans over to electric and eventually our way vehicles. We're fundraising as much as we can. And we really want to try to expand across the border. We have a lot of north-south transportation to Waltham and Watertown and some to Wellesley. And if we can get a sense what that's like, ultimately, this is about building a regional transportation system that supplements the MBTA. So we want to see what does it look like when we cross those borders, because transit should not be one city doing one thing and the next city doing another. So hopefully we can plant the seeds and test that out in our next phase. So that is all I want to talk about. I want to say thank you to all of you. I hope you're awake, and I'd love to answer any of your questions.
All right, thank you, Nicole. And yes, as regional transit or transportation planners, we love to hear that regional perspective and to hear people talking about collaborating. So let's go over to Chris for our final presentation.
Oh, I am Chris Van Eyken. I am a manager at TransitCenter. We are a New York City-based foundation with a national focus. We look towards improving transit in cities across the U.S. in order to build more sustainable and equitable cities. Yes, so during this presentation, I'll be referring to some of our research that we've done on transit in general, but also some on microtransit to talk about the things that transit riders want to see out of transit and microtransit. And our surveys have identified a few things that you've probably often heard from your riders, that what's prized the most is frequent, reliable service, short travel times, and safe, comfortable vehicles and stations. This has remained consistent across the years. Our first survey was in 2016, I believe, repeated that a few years later, and then had another one last year during COVID to see if those values had changed. And they had not. They were pretty consistent. Our riders still want to see the same things. They want to see a frequent, reliable service that they know they go to their stop, that they'll see a bus and they'll be able to get to where they want to go in a timely manner and in a safe way. How have we delivered this traditionally as public transit agencies? We've built comprehensive networks that give predictable service across the city or region. This sort of builds a network effect. This is why it's a transit network, where you know that you can get anywhere in a city by using that service, no matter where you are. It should be understandable and legible, even if you haven't regularly ridden a route or it's your first time, you know that it's going to travel in a predictable, safe manner and that you can look to the map to figure out where you're going to go. At the individual level, we try to make sure these routes are direct so that they're understandable again, but also so they provide efficient service to as many folks as possible. This is the real benefit of public transit here. You get these agglomeration effects when you have lots of people in one vehicle at a time, which is why we try to use large buses or biotechs in some cases when needed. And that leads to a system where the whole becomes greater than the sum, the routes that make up that system. There are, of course, difficulties in doing this. We have many shortcomings across the US in delivering service like this. And a lot of that is because we have limited resources. It makes it very difficult to provide high quality service to all people across the city. And due to traffic and scarce street space, it makes the delivery of reliable service, even in places where we do have enough money to run lots of buses, sort of impossible task. You just can't expect a bus to run according to its schedule all the time. There are just going to be cases when it just does not meet the needs of the people it's meant to serve. And even when we had this funding, again, there's competition for service allocation. And we've seen this talked about in the presentation, especially Patrick's. We have this sort of tension between providing routes that maximize ridership and those that provide coverage across the service area. And if we were just trying to get most people on the bus as possible, we would just make these straight routes everywhere. But we do have a need to meet the needs of everyone in our cities, especially because they are important ridership groups and political constituencies. So they demand that they also see the benefit of public transit services. And this is a place where lots of systems have looked to microtransit as sort of in between to solve this issue for cities. And here is a graphic that Jarrett Walker uses to describe this problem. You've heard him refer to in Patrick's presentation earlier, where if we run just straight fixed route service everywhere, we can maximize ridership, but we're not getting the coverage needed to cover a city in a total. And if we could wave a magic wand and solve all the land use issues in the United States, we could totally develop in a way where we could just build everything for ridership. But we have service areas that are more suburban or rural in characteristics, and we need to have coverage routes to meet those people's needs. And so, as you've seen in previous presentations here, microtransit, again, is a tool that has been used to solve this issue. In some places, we just run low frequency fixed route service, but that is also low productivity and does not always work for all riders. How can we improve the transit that we have better? This is more of a statement on just our ridership routes. We have proven tools for increasing ridership, and that's to increase speed and reliability through the use of bus lanes, through bus stop balancing, through creating routes that don't stop too frequently, signal prioritization so we're not losing too much time at lights, and implementing all-door boarding to reduce dwell times. For the coverage routes, we can do a better job of building walkable transit-oriented neighborhoods and cities. This is something that I think lots of transit planners find frustrating because it's something we don't really have an effect on. It's land use. It's not something that a transit agency can impact other than voicing its concerns about it. But concentrating development along transit corridors, existing transit corridors, and making them walkable and safe to be around is a great way to get people back onto traditional routes. And concentrating transit improvement in those areas where they do exist in suburbs and rural areas is a way that we can serve them with traditional transit. But what about microtransit services? This is what we're here to talk about today. There is a place for microtransit, especially in a comprehensive redesign where it's planned in a way that you're providing the maximum service to areas that are more urban characteristic, but you're finding a way to get people on those services if they're in more spread out areas, first mile, last mile solutions we talk about often. And if it's planned in a way where it's complemented by increasing walkability and bikeability and making sure that folks have other alternatives, it can work well. An issue is, though, if we're trying to simply throw it in places that are not well served by walking or by transit, it's often coming at a high cost and is not very productive for an agency to run. And so for TransitCenter, we've identified 3 things to consider when you're considering microtransit. And again, it's that productivity problem. A lot of microtransit services cost more to run than a fixed route service. And this is, in some cases, even when you're having a fixed route service where only maybe 10 people board a day, replacing that with a microtransit service doesn't necessarily mean you're lowering cost or saving money for the agency. Sometimes you're raising the cost and maybe even losing some of those 10 people that used to ride that service. And existing projects across the country have typically underperformed fixed route services and that they've replaced and failed to attract new riders. We've seen some cases where that has been successful, but it's not often the case that you replace a fixed route service with something that's more flexible, that folks are going to come and ride that instead. In often case, they're going to find a friend to drive them or get an Uber or Lyft, or just buy the car they've always wanted to have because they're in an area better served by a car. There's an opportunity cost here too. The money spent on microtransit can be used to improve transit in places where people do really rely upon transit and ride them frequently. And so you have to, as an agency, really consider whether or not it's worthwhile to spend the money on a microtransit pilot to pull in riders that can be served better by Uber or Lyft or a car, or use that to, fund better bus stops in dense areas where you have lots of ridership already. And we've talked about this tension on the call already, and I welcome the discussion about it later. So what role is microtransit meant to play? It can be an improvement over existing paratransit services. I think we saw that with the Numo example, where you often have paratransit services that have really failed their ridership. And by implementing the technology and new modes of operating that microtransit is provided, you're providing a better service to your customer and making sure that they have the mobility that they need to go about their daily lives. And it can be a real improvement for those folks and should be treated seriously. And microtransit can fill gaps in typographies that are not well served by fixed route services. So in places where, like we talked about industrial parks earlier, or places that are very sprawled, have very irregular grids, or just have topographies that make it difficult for buses to travel on them. Seattle had a really good success with Pilot with VIA in an area where it was just too hard to get their buses up a hillside. And especially when it rained, they just couldn't run service there frequently. So having a smaller vehicle that could serve on those areas was a real godsend for people that live in those neighborhoods. And I just want to talk about the mixed results that we've seen from some examples across the country. LA Metro has a much vaunted partnership with VIA, but they really saw low ridership in those routes, and they were paying a lot more per trip than they had on the previous fixed route service. It was about twice actually, and they weren't serving as many riders because they hadn't thought carefully about how microtransit would be an improvement over the fixed route service that existed already. King County, again, though, did have success with VIA in a similar manner, but they thought about it comprehensively and put it in an area where, just regular transit service wasn't going to work well. And so by extending their network rather than replacing their network with microtransit service, they were able to really serve folks in those neighborhoods effectively rather than replacing a bus that could have done what the VIA service was already doing better. Another example of a failure here is AC Flex in Oakland. It was meant to be a feeder for the BART system, and it replaced fixed route services, but it ended up only getting 3 riders per revenue hour and versus only 6 on the bus, which still isn't great. But that bus operated at much lower operating costs and was still able to connect folks to the transit service that they needed in the end. And so if it had been carefully planned out, it could have been, you do have to try things new, but sometimes you have to admit defeat and sort of bring back the service that was working before. And another success, again, I talked about this, is just the way microtransit handles dispatching, putting it on an app, giving people the ability to text or still call, as many folks need to do, can really improve the responsiveness and reliability of paratransit services, especially if the vehicles have good geotagging and you're able to track where they are and the riders know where they are and can count on them when they need them. It can be a real improvement for those folks. And it's a real strong area for a strong case for using microtransit more comprehensively for cities. So microtransit, in TransitCenter's opinion, is something that can complement but not replace fixed route service. it's just never going to be able to accomplish what we can accomplish with a reliable fixed route. But there are places where it does fit in because a fixed route isn't a viable opportunity for an agency. And there are proven solutions for improving fixed route service. It's just not always going to work. So we have to think carefully where we put microtransit services to sort of expand our networks and make sure we're not doing it in places where a fixed route can work well, but in places where we know a fixed route's just not going to work because of typography or because of sprawl or something else. And then implementing the microtransit in a way where we're thinking of programming it so the costs don't run out of control, so it's effectively serving its target population, and so it's not pulling folks off of the fixed route services that operate at a higher efficiency just because the per person costs tend to be lower on a fixed route service. And I think one thing to address here is we haven't talked much about the pandemic, but everyone believes that there's going to be a great shift in how folks work. And we've seen that writers have shifted from work from home, but still fixed route services is always going to be needed. We have many folks that are still dependent upon it for their day-to-day journeys. And we want to be sure that we're not chasing some of these writers that are now working from home with new flashy services and spending money on them when we still have vulnerable communities that very much need funding for their day-to-day travel on a fixed route service. And we need to make sure that we're not taking away from them because these communities tend to be lower income, they tend to be Black and brown, and they still throughout the pandemic have relied upon fixed route service. And we want to make sure those are still fully funded and can be used reliably by those folks. And that's all I have.
All right, thank you so much, Chris. So recognizing that it is in fact almost 2 o'clock, I see we have a great discussion going on in the chat. But if we can go to the next slide, Matt, I just want to throw some discussion questions at our presenters. And if you want to jump in and respond to any of these, then please just go ahead and unmute yourselves. And I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit here because I know we're not going to get to all of these. And I just want to prioritize some over the others. So we'll start with the bottom one. What are some of the misconceptions about microtransit, positive or negative, that you have encountered or dealt with? And any of you should feel free to kind of jump in and say something about that.
One of the big issues, sorry.
Nope, you go.
Okay, one of the big issues in our area has been when we switched over to microtransit, like I said before, a lot of the areas we used our dial-a-ride vehicles to run the service, and that resulted in people not really understanding that it was open to everybody. Even though we wrapped the vehicles, even though we rebranded them, even though we, explained to people, it's still very much the conception that these smaller vans with wheelchair lifts are specifically for seniors and persons with disabilities and aren't for everybody. So that was a huge issue.
I would say to Chris's point, number one, fixed route is cheaper, most likely cheaper on a per person rate if you can do fixed route. Microtransit is very expensive. There's a minimum scale you need to make it work. So it's not a magic solution for everything. And I think you need to be very selective in when and where and how you use it.
Great, thank you. So microtransit, and I know we've touched on this a little bit, typically works with a phone-based app or a web presence. How are any you guys in your various interfaces with microtransit tackling, including riders who may not have a smartphone? And I think I would append to this a related question that came up in the chat, which is, do drivers get training about dealing with disabled folks? What coordination do you have with the disability community in terms of making sure that the service is accessible?
So 80% of our seniors book by smartphone. That number's coming down. And for them, they can call in with any phone. They go to the customer service people on the back end. It's going through the app. So the drivers don't know the difference. It doesn't work as well because if the vehicle is delayed or they switch vehicle, there's no way to then necessarily contact the senior who might be calling from a landline or from the hospital or wherever they are. your second question was about coordination with the Disability Commission. We're now working a lot with Jeannie Fairley, who's our disability coordinator for the city of Newton, to talk about making it a good service for people that need the care. You know, we changed out the vehicles to help people get in and out better into sedans. We have a special system now where anyone that is approved with a disability gets the door-to-door service instead of the corner-to-corner. And we've been working with her. The one thing we will be doing is keeping it shared. We've had some requests from the disability community for private trips, and we said, nope, this is a shared service.
Any of our other panelists like to comment on that? All right.
I don't know the exact data of how many of our trips have been requested via the app versus the phone, but I do know that the app's been much more greatly used rather than the phone, and that's actually been identified by staff as a challenge, particularly as I mentioned in the conversation in areas with more seniors or more low income. We've had some challenges getting the awareness of the phone, but to transition that to the next part of the question, 80% of our service is subcontracted through a local provider, which does have to have training for differently abled populations. And when you do request the ride, you can specify either through your profile or on a specific ride your needs. And so we set it up that way through the app, so we know that dispatch can make sure it's the appropriate type of ride for the type of passenger.
So before I ask any more questions, do any of our panelists need to go strictly right at 2 o'clock? I know it's now 1:57 Eastern. All right, well, we'll keep it going for a little while longer. So what microtransit operators or operations out there, other than your own, if applicable, do you see as exemplary models or as setting best practices? And I would ask the opposite question, you know, which ones do you see as doing a bad job, but we don't want to throw anybody under the microtransit vehicle here.
I think I'll cite that Seattle case where, you know, it wasn't the most high productivity route they have, but having that via service that really expands their network to places where you can't have a fixed route service just because of typography or another consideration, I think is one of the real promises of microtransit. Sometimes having that smaller vehicle or having something that doesn't have to conform to the street grid is a real way to make sure you're serving people in places where you just can't get a bus, because those folks too deserve transit service as well.
Anybody else? So we've heard about a variety of different operating models here. Do any of you have thoughts on kind of, is there a best way to operate microtransit? Should it be operated directly by a public entity, contracted to a private company? I know, Nicole, you had talked about the value of having a turnkey operation. Who should manage operations, and how should the funding work? Obviously, we all know there are constraints on how the funding does work in the real world. But is there a particular alignment of particular things that would work in an ideal kind of a fashion if you were the dictator of microtransit?
I mean, I'm a firm believer that public transportation should be public. You know, you can take microtransit and do it privately, but we're not going to hit our public sector goals. If we are, you know, overseeing it and it's a public transportation system, we can hit, you know, our equity goals, our sustainability goals, our job access goals. In terms of managing operations, in our case, we're not set up to do operations. We're a city. We're not a transit agency. I think the conversation in the chat is really important. You know, microtransit companies currently are using independent contractors. As a city, is that something that we should and want to support? And, you know, if it's, you know, if the public is operating it, there's probably full-time employees. I think there should be on the funding, ongoing operations funding for microtransit that is sort of correctly implemented and achieving important goals. We don't want to implement microtransit because it's sexy and because it's cool and, pay $40 a trip. There are times when we do think it's okay to support a trip for $10 or $20 a trip. And there's things we can do to get those costs down. So I think appropriately implemented successful microtransit should have an ongoing operations funding. And I don't think we can expect developers to pay for all of that. That's developers paying for it is us paying for it and them not supporting public, affordable housing or something else. So, there's only so much money in the world.
I think Nicole really nailed it, that that's a broader political question about goals of public policy, where we as a transit agency decided that some cost savings, probably not maximum cost savings, was the goal, that sort of the overriding goal, in order to maximize our available operations dollars to improve service elsewhere. I would love it if we had more operational dollars, and we're working on that. But it would also be great if we had more federal operational dollars to help with that, especially here where we're not getting anything from the state.
I think overall it's important to think of all of these kind of services as like a toolbox. And I think that it's not going to look the same in every community, and it's not going to look the same in every area. But it might make sense for in one particular town that has a lot of Uber drivers for you to contract with them, because it might make sense for you geographically or financially. But it also might make sense that instead of running a fixed route all the way up, to kind of do partially a fixed route and then, do a microtransit or an after hours thing. So instead of running a fixed route till 8 p.m., maybe you stop the fixed route at 6, and then within a certain geographical area, you add microtransit to kind of cover those later night trips. I think moving forward, I think we're going to have to be more flexible than we've been in the past, just because we have to respond to more changing things. We can't use, data to plan that's kind of like 5 years old. It's no longer relevant. So I think it's just creating this toolbox of different services and kind of having them to kind of pick and choose what works is kind of going to be our moving forward as far as we go. I think, me personally, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Angie. Well, I think actually that's a terrific message to kind of wrap up on. I know we are past our 2:00 deadline, and we've had a great Q&A going in the chat. So I think we'll skip the live Q&A section of this so we can get people out of here. But also, I think our presenters will probably be okay if I offer to put folks who have further questions in touch with you. We'll distribute the recording and the slides by email to all registrants, along with your contact information after the event. So people can ask further questions then if you have them, or if they come to you later. Yeah, so we're just going to talk a little bit to wrap up. And thank you again to all of our presenters and to the questions that people have been asking in the chat. This has been a really terrific conversation. I hope it's been really educational. I know it's been helping me think through a lot of things. So we're just going to talk a little bit about some upcoming events. So just in case you want to keep following up on the conversation, ways to keep in touch with us: sign up for the MPO's email list, for MAPC's email list. You can follow us at the MPO, MAPC, or the MBTA Advisory Board on social media. And you can check out past meeting recordings, and we will be putting this one up on our YouTube channel as well. We have a couple upcoming events: Transit Working Group meeting on February 10th. That's a Thursday at 4 p.m. If you want to be on the email list specific to the Transit Working Group, you can email me at sjohnston@ctps.org. And finally, here's my contact information and Travis's on the screen: sjohnston@ctps.org, tpollock@mapc.org. If you have any questions or want to follow up on anything from this meeting. And with that, again, a huge thank you to our presenters. Thank you for putting in the time and effort to pull together all of this really fascinating information. Clearly lots of work went into these presentations. And thank you to everybody for coming out at midday on a Tuesday after a holiday. And with that, have a great afternoon, stay warm, stay safe, and keep thinking about transit.